Good afternoon. Good afternoon, those in the back. How you doing? Good. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Rashida Phillips. I'm the executive director here at the American Jazz Museum, and we are really pleased to have a special guest in conversation with us today. We are carrying forward our Big Break series, and most of you who were with us last year or earlier this year realized that we had put together a series that we called the Big Break that was inspired by the Disney Soul programming. And that was really because it centered on a musician who found himself at a point in his life that he really received a life-changing opportunity. And so we'd like to continue to feature those sort of life-changing destiny opportunities with special guests as they come through the Jazz Museum and come to the Blue Room. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you, all of our museum friends and our members. Thank you so much for supporting us for over the years. We want to experience a powerful musical and conversation with you too. And if you're tuning in online, thank you also for joining us. How many of you have had a life-changing experience that made you think differently about yourself or the world around you? I can see some hands up. Great. We're continuing to explore these themes in our Big Break series, showcasing musicians in and around Kansas City and throughout the world who influence or are influenced by jazz, to learn about those life-changing big break moments from their career and the role of destiny on their path towards success. Today, I'm ecstatic to sit next to one of the rising premier world pianists and first South African artist signed to the illustrious Blue Note Jazz label, now on Blue Note Africa imprint, Mr. Nduduzo Makhathini. Let's put our hands together and welcome Nduduzo.
Thank you.
Thank you. Raised in a lush and rugged South African landscape where music and ritual practices are symbolically linked, pianist Nduduzo Makhathini plays with profound spirituality. His experiences as a traditional Zulu healer are inseparable from his improvisational performance. Embracing histories of South African jazz legends, Beke Masuku, you might have to help me with these names, Moses Moleleku, Abdullah Abraham. Makhathini also blends influences from the great American jazz canon like John Coltrane, McCoy Tyner, and Randy Weston, to name a few. There's truly a cross-continental, multi-layered melodic sound that he creates. In 2018, Universal Music Group Africa signed Makhathini, a leader of the current South African jazz scene, whose second UMG album, Modes of Communications, Letters from the Underworlds, were released jointly on Blue Note Records. The album drew wide acclaim across Africa, Europe, and the United States, with the New York Times naming it one of the best jazz albums of 2020, and Downbeat magazine naming Nduduzo among their 25 for the future, a short list of jazz artists with the potential to shape the genre. So we are really honored to welcome you here again today. I want to talk a little bit about your music and your creative process. I'm really wondering what inspires you.
Well, many things. I think just being in the world, in a true sense, is enough to give birth to a song. And so there's a sense in which, like, part of being is part of the broader project of listening. So I think inspiration is really a product of listening. And of course, this is anchored in many philosophical thoughts, or mythical kind of stories in Africa that really locate this sense of knowing as listening. It's embedded in our languages. When we say, for instance, in the Basotho cultures, we say dumelang, and then we say likai, and likai means where are you situated in space. That is just a greeting, and the person responding is kiteng, meaning I am situated in space. So this listening is something that is not limited to the body, but a deeper listening to cosmology, a deeper listening to the spirit paradigms as well. And similarly, would say to feel ukuzwa, which means also to hear, is to feel. There is one word for those two. So the kind of feeling, and hutsiba, which means to hear, it also means to understand. So I think given the spectrum of the sonic and being located quite intensely inside a cosmology, there is kind of a given that inspiration will come if you are really listening. So thinking about sounds as ways of being in the world, or singing as a way of an expression of being in the world, as a vocality of being, then by extension is married, all of it, inside a cosmology, ontology, and epistemology. So this is really what underpins a lot of what I do. And of course, that extends to societal ills. It extends to ritual ceremonies, their repertoires. So you get all of these inspirations, but I think quite central to it, we have to locate sound as this expression of being.
So how is healing situated in that practice, in that work?
Yeah. Well, again, we have a word for, if you are sick, we say uyagula, and there is an object, a calabash that is called igula, and what it does is it stores liquids to maturity. So that's what we use to make beer, traditional beer. And at a particular point, you have to start serving because it's matured. And similarly, that's where we put like milk, and it converts to amasi and all of these things. So there's a sense in which this idea of being sick has to do with carrying something, to carry ukugula. And of course, the people that are healers are people that have got more storage and more capacity to kind of keep all of these things. But then the important part becomes ritual, which is then an extension, which becomes an outlet, right? So this would speak to the heavy kind of difference in Western medicine and African medicine, whereby, for instance, healing in Western terms is a kind of a level of coexisting with the sickness. So for instance, in a kind of vaccination, it's plugging in the sickness in the body, so it's recognized, and there's a kind of living together. On the extreme opposite, in African medicine, it's about getting things to come out. So this kind of like idea of healing is very much linked with the broader kind of dimension of what being sick is about. So these are the things that are happening in the continent currently, where people are always oriented to seeking an outlet for healing. So healing is closely related to an outlet, and that's why sounds become important, because sound are these carriers. So when people go into this kind of what the ethnomusicologists have called spirit possession, but in essence, it's the letting out. So in other words, we could argue that healing is a dimension that is constantly ongoing, and people compose themselves into this dimension whereby it becomes an outlet. So healing, we could say, is a mode of surrender, and music, at least jazz and improvisation, seeks of us to constantly surrender. So surrendering into this body, which becomes an outlet that can carry the things that we can't carry.
Beautiful. It's like that body composition becomes a composition on the page.
Of course.
Right?
Of course.
Yeah. You kind of started to answer this, but I'm wondering what does being from South Africa mean to you? I know that's a big question.
Being from South Africa, well, as we all know, South Africa is the last country to receive its independence. So we suffered many things for a very long time. And so being in South Africa is partly the suffering, but it's also this past that is so important to us, that we constantly trying to evoke as part of the indigenous kind of method of thinking about problem solving. And then we also now have this kind of quote unquote illusion of the post apartheid South Africa that continues to have moments that invoke the apartheid system or the colonial system in a deep way. So I think South Africa, similarly to maybe other places, is a place that's currently challenged with the notion of time. When we refer, for instance, to the pre-colonial or the indigenous, the initial kind of like our ancestors and what they believed in, we refer to that as the pre-colonial. And then we refer to the moment of the colonial as the colonial, and we refer to the post as the post-colonial. So there's this kind of invocation of the colonial constantly with regards to our notion of time. For instance, why would you call something the pre-colonial if there was no colonization at the time? So what is this submitting to this kind of like, system that really disadvantages you? Why must that govern your perception of time? So there's a sense in which we're dealing with that kind of like triangle with regards to our notions of time. When we're thinking about decolonizing, we are also thinking about why is it important to mention the word decolonization. So in a sense, all the efforts in South Africa, go into this sparse vocabulary of things that actually don't do anything, where a word like democracy does not have anything to do with democracy, but it's become a buzz term, where a word such as a rainbow nation is just an abstract concept that was not really engaged in terms of like, what are the properties? What composes a democratic society? What are the ingredients? What is the posture? What is the orientation of a society that subscribes to such a system? So I think these are some of the variations of being. And of course, there's a generation, people my age, that is kind of like looking carefully at indigenous belief systems and how do those liberate, as opposed to using what this one author Mudimbe calls the colonial library, using the tools that were initially created against you to kind of fight a particular system. So being in South Africa, in short, is dealing with conflict, but seeking to crystallize your own standpoint.
I think we certainly deal with a lot of that here over in the States.
Of course.
Some of those terms like post-racial, I think about that. Everything is oriented around the race, racializing society. So certainly there's some commonalities and some struggles there. Yeah. When I went to South Africa, at this point, it was probably a few years ago, had a wonderful opportunity to tour Johannesburg and Durban. I was really struck by the scene there, the music scene, extremely vibrant scene. Absolutely talented folks who were really carrying on quite a few traditions, not only traditional music, but the jazz scene, hip-hop scene, etc. Just wondering about the connections that you have coming here with the music that you're playing. Are there connections, especially in Kansas City? We know that this is considered where jazz grew up. This is considered the home of jazz. New Orleans is the birthplace, but we consider this the home. So with folks like Charlie Parker, Mary Lou Williams, Count Basie, there's such a rich tradition here of the music. And I'm pleased to see folks like Logan Richardson, who's one of our homeboys here in town, performing with you as well. So wondering about some of those connections that you found to the States and to Kansas City.
Yeah, I mean, the connections are very explicit, they're very evident, they are political, they're philosophical, they're historic, they all of these things. And I think it's just worth kind of like going back a little bit to the transatlantic and the slave trade moment as the moment of no choice, right? This was a very aggressive moment, a very violent system, a very aggressive system that took people from the continent, brought them to a foreign land. So there was a kind of discontinuity with place, this kind of notion of displacement, and fast forwarding to a moment where I have a choice to go over the Atlantic and be here. So I think that is an important thing to kind of consider in as our standpoint in these conversations. What does it mean to now have a choice? What does it mean for Logan to cross over? He's been coming to South Africa a lot of time to do some work with me. And so I think that's kind of the backdrop. But also, what does it mean to be in Kansas City as a place of refusal via the sonic? How Parker refused to forget, you know, and how his sound was a mode of protest, of course. And if we listen carefully yesterday, there were very specific moments where Logan not only invoked the spirit of Charlie Parker, but played a very specific phrase from the Charlie Parker vocabulary in a deliberate moment. So we also thinking about that as one of the matrix, the magic, the mythical part that the transatlantic wasn't able to erase. Because of course there were all kinds of moments of the erasure when dance was banned, singing was banned and everything, but there are these parts that refused. And I think jazz, if we think about, for instance, the African music as being, most of it being based on a pentatonic scale, and that's a 5-note scale, but it's got a symbolism. And you think about the blues scale, it's a 6-note scale that has a raised fourth. So this kind of collective memory is invoked in that, the fact that we are not separated. It was important for the blues to carry very much of the pentatonic scale as a kind of signal. If ever anything forgets, this will be a reminder that we belong together. We have this collective memory that leads to a collective project of remembering. And I think being here now, kind of citing Parker as the sonic on the bandstand, but we're also citing Parker's pain. We're also bringing the healing vibration, and we're bringing to the fore this kind of like collective memory and our refusal to forget. So Kansas City becomes a very important place for me. And I mean, you know, when we start jazz in South Africa, we start right from Charlie Parker. In fact, some of the innovators in jazz were likened to Charlie Parker. Kippie Moeketsi was one of the first alto players to be recorded, and he was called the Charlie Parker of South Africa. And so is Soweto, which was thought of the Kansas City or the New Orleans of South Africa, you know, Sofia Town, Umkhumbane, and various townships that were not only thinking and dialoguing with the diasporas, but even the jazz codes were ways of dialoguing. If you look at those pictures in the 30s of jazz in South Africa, you swear these people were in Kansas. You know what I mean? So this is a legacy that our ancestors have left for us. The big band tradition in Umkhumbane and in Port Elizabeth, you know, the Count Basie music and how it moved and dialogued with what was happening there. We can think about Duke Ellington and how he dialogues with South Africa. So there's a sense in which we need to assume a different posture to sound and think about what is inherent in the sound. What are these properties that help us to have these conversations? So there is a different way of listening to sound, a different register that starts to pick up these codes. At the time, they didn't want to tell the system that was brutal to black people. They didn't want to tell them what they were talking about. But we have an opportunity now to look at those codes and reveal these meanings. What were these guys saying? What did tempo mean? Playing so fast in this bebop era, Charlie Parker, what was the significance of tempo? What was the significance of triplet? What was the significance of syncopation? So all of these things are not just music things and things that were nice to do, but they have symbolisms. Yeah.
And really an understanding of self. You know, when you kind of get into the DNA of it all, you realize that there's so much, there's such a rich opportunity to understand self through music, community through music, and how that legacy continues to play on. You know, this series is called The Big Break, so we always like to ask, and Logan had an interesting answer to this, but we talked about, you know, what was that turning point in your career? What was that point, that big break moment that really sort of shifted you into where you are leading to now?
Yeah, I think Logan, I suspect, really had an incredible answer to this, and
He
I
said
doubt.
just one moment. He's like, I had so many moments. They're still happening. That's what he was saying.
Oh, beautiful, man. For me, I don't recall any moment, because in terms of my orientation in music, it's always been there. So I think that moment would be my very birth. Like I was born into songs. In the same way that like people are born into stories, and we start creating our own stories within a bigger story. So for me, the moment of the break is the moment of birth. And of course, it's connected to the mother as the source, but it's also connected to our creation story as the Zulu people. We say we broke off the reeds, sadabuka ohlangeni. So the break for us was that very moment, that initial moment of becoming. And then we constantly are becoming. And this idea of umuntu, the mu is this process of becoming. So we constantly are becoming. So I don't have that moment due to the kind of situatedness of music in my culture, in my cosmology. There was no moment without songs. We have all different kinds of songs. Songs of birth. So when I was born, there was a song. So, and of course, the moments that come later that will count as like breaks, for me, will take away from serious breaks of breaking into being, of breaking into song, or breaking into a cosmology. Yeah, and also my kind of musical journey has been troubled with curriculum, and so I don't refer to that moment of starting music as the break, because I feel like this was a moment that kind of dragged me backwards. Actually, that period dragged for quite a bit, and it became about remembering really what happened before in order to survive this moment of encountering curriculum that came from elsewhere, that was enunciating epistemologies of others, and where I couldn't situate myself. So I'm unable to refer to that as I really know the break.
I wonder if you might share a little motif or something inspired by the album. I know that we want folks to come and see you at the Blue Room Live, but maybe if you could play just a little something for us from the new album. And then those of you in the audience, please get some questions ready, because we'd love to have you ask a few questions too.
Yathi ciko ciko yabhabha inyoni. Simakade mdali wezulu nomhlaba. Sikhuleka kuwe mveli inqangi. Nomkhubulwane siyakhuleka. Malehle ulaka. Kwelikamthaniya. wezulu nomhlaba siyakhuleka. Yanini le ndizela phezulu. Yathi ciko ciko, yathi ciko ciko yabhabha inyoni. Ekuqaleni wawukhona namanje usekhona mvela inqangi mdali wezulu nomhlaba. Yathi ciko ciko, yathi ciko ciko yabhabha inyoni.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question while our audience gets questions together. I'm always wondering about emerging musicians. We always see emerging as if you stop emerging, right? You're kind of always emerging. But those who are aspiring, any advice to them?
Ooh. Well, I always just think there is power in stories. And if there is a beautiful, or if you can create a dialogue between yourself and your story, that often is really special. Some of my favorite artists are the ones that were able to locate their stories in the sound. So I think a deep relationship with story creates a really great artist, I think. And again, I keep referring to my native tongue because there's a sense in which the English language does not really, there's a terrible feedback that is, if I still have to play tonight, it's not good. Do I have to use it? Okay. So the story, again, for me, it's twofold. It's the storing, as in the telling of your story, but the storing, as in what lives inside. The store, like you store something. So I think it's a beautiful way to think about keeping particular things that define who you are really intact as part of this storing, while you allow yourself to float and evolve and constantly be in this mode of becoming as the storing, this telling of the story. So I think that would be the way to go for me. Yeah.
You mentioned folks who inspire you. Any other musicians out here who are really critical to your growth and development?
Too many. Yeah. Well, I think the greatest musician that inspired me was my grandmother. And of course it extends to my mother, who just recently put out her debut. I mean, she sacrificed for so many years, for me to study music and kind of put her whole thing behind. So me and my wife started this record label back in 2012, and we've put out like 11 albums. And so we're thinking, man, we have to do something for the old lady. And she keeps writing these songs, And so this one time I said, how many songs do you have? And she asked me a question, how old are you? I got my answer there. So that conversation ended like that. I have as many songs as I've brought you up. So those are all different songs. So then I brought this recorder and recorded about 40 of them and sat down with the kids. I was like, which of Granny's songs are cool? We need to select about 8 or 9 to create an album. So that's really one of my greatest inspirations. And of course, my community, all the way to now being introduced to jazz and Monk, McCoy Tyner, Billie Holiday, Busi Mhlongo, Bheki Mseleku, and many other musicians, and also my peers, like people like Logan, people like Jason Moran, and so many African Kids back home. Yeah, it just never. I think I get a piece of something from everybody. So everyone that we know has inspired me in some way.
Beautiful. How about any questions from the audience? Anyone out there have a question?
First of all, thank you for being in Kansas City. It's so wonderful to see your music and your assets here. And I think a part of that is, in the last 2 years, has been quite a ride. And you being here is proof that we're getting back. The world's waking up. So my question is, how do you see the jazz community coming back as a stronger organism now that we're getting back to it?
Yeah. Well, I think people are coming back with stronger stories, if anything. And again, to this centrality of the story. Particularly for me, I got to play a lot of solo piano during lockdown. And I think there's kind of like, just physically, like there's a kind of deep relationship with the instrument that, but also what was also happening was this, musicians are always on a move. There's been so many authors that use this term, musician on the move. But it was interesting for me to think about what does it mean to then produce the sounds from a space of stillness. So there was this kind of stillness, I think, that I hear in every musician that's coming out and playing. Like, there are these moments where we really want to play quiet, we really want to play slow, so that's impacted on us but also there's a sense in which the stillness was dealing with how the cracks in the systems, different places were exposed. So it's a kind of like very heavy kind of stillness, and I sense it harmonically. I hear a lot of people playing really dark harmonies now, kind of really heavy on the kind of dark as in heavy harmonies. We hear less of like the brighter chords, the chords that are kind of smiling. Maybe it's just me, and the people that I'm attracted to are projecting a more of an intense density in the sound. So that's for me, that's great, because we have renewed our relationship with the art form. How is the art form able to speak for us now? And I think that's what made the 60s, during the civil rights movement. That's why some of the greatest records came out in those times, because musicians were forced to play for something. You know what I mean? Now we're really playing for something. And of course, with the introduction of jazz into curriculum, people were playing because they went to study music. I don't think that's a good reason. I'm not against it. I teach in a university, but I think musicians have deeper reasons to play now, and that's changing how we sound.
Great question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you also for being here. Could you speak for a moment to maybe what the perception among young people in South Africa is about old folk music of like Miriam Makeba and Hugh Masekela? I mean, do they think it's corny, or do they like it as a sense of tradition? Or
Yeah. I love the choice of words, because I think that's where the answer is. And it's a beautiful way to think about what are the contributions of South Africa that are particular in this very broad jazz definition. And like you say, the word folk for me is important, because jazz in South Africa has always dialogued with the folkness of the sounds. So that means the language, the landscapes, the different people, the different religious spiritual belief systems. And so Miriam Makeba and those people are important for that reason. They became the transition, that dialogue between a music that they encountered via records in the 20s in South Africa, and the kind of music that was there before. So I a lot of people like Makeba, all of the music they played is still regarded as African or South African jazz standards. So it's part of the canon. It's pretty much, the vocabulary that informs even our creations now.
I guess I ask because it's not that easy to get a kid to listen to Thelonious Monk. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I know what you're talking about. It's and maybe some credit needs to be given to the house musicians in South Africa that have been remixing this music, this idea of a remix. And you might not think of this as being related to jazz, but you can think of it in hip hop, and how hip hop sampled a lot of the jazz that, and in that way brought it to the attention of the younger audiences. So there's a lot of that in South Africa, where you find Busim Mhlongo or Philip Tabane or Madalagnene in a record, in a house record. And I've never thought of it, but now spontaneously I'm thinking, well, maybe there's a relationship there. You know, kind of like, how do we keep invoking this memory? You know what I mean? So it's a dying relationship, but I think in the institutions we try to keep that relationship quite intact in terms of what we prescribe for materials in the classroom, and but what we play in gigs as well. Yeah. Thank you.
I think there's also power in exchange, right? I've got a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old, but my oldest was singing Misty when she was 6. And that's, I'm a jazz vocalist, so part of that is biasness, but part of that is when they're young, that's foundational.
Yeah.
And we exchange now. So she might introduce me to, the new Drake album. And that's the way we have that dialogue. When you mention dialogue and story, that's what we have. We exchange those foundations with each other, and you can really connect the dots and really hear all of that journey through the music. So instead of, I think, sort of pushing it aside and expecting kids when they get a little bit older to sit down and listen to Billie Holiday, when they're 2 and they're listening to Billie Holiday, it's just a part of sort of the everydayness of life.
That's very true. I mean, it reminds me of my jives. Now, we don't have kids at home. The boys are in boarding school, and my daughter is in tertiary, so we don't. But it reminds me of a lot of jives from East London to Pietermaritzburg at home. And my wife is a big A.B. Lincoln fan, so she doesn't mind playing all the A.B. Lincoln albums for like 10 hours. Right. And my kids don't mind that. Well, they didn't. They never used to mind that. I don't know now, to your question. But I remember this one time we were listening to, there's this Makhathini song that they love so much. So because they started hearing this music when they were young. So it's just part of their memory. Oh, man.
I'm sorry,
Man, I only remember how the album cover looks like, but I can't really from the top of my head. But I'll find it, and yeah. But so Makhathini uses a lot of this like kind of pentatonic. I know it was not walk spirit, talk spirit, but that kind of melody is really part of our folkness as well in South Africa. So there is a sense in which this memory of the transatlantic is so embedded in the memory of the continent as well. You know what I mean? And some of the things that the continent doesn't remember, will probably remember via the diasporas. So there's a sense in which we always think about Africa as the source. Of course it is. But we don't think about how things are eroding in Africa and how little the diaspora has of the Africanness, and they've held on to that for the longest time in a much deeper commitment than assuming it's still around. So there's a beautiful thing that happens there that I think of as an echo. So drawing from an echo, and the echo echoes back into the continent. So there is that kind of relationship. What does it mean to be having some of the most ancient memories of Africa in the diasporas? Yoruba is a good example. In Cuba, they speak some of the most ancient Yoruba than they have in Nigeria. In Nigeria, some words have been forgotten over the years. So when they hear that, they're like, oh man, this is an ancient version. So that's interesting for me. It changes the kind of post-China discourses across the Atlantic, that we can really help each other in this collective memory.
So in Nigeria and Ethiopia and northern African countries, there's a very heavy funk movement that has influenced the United States in the last 20 years greatly. Antibalas has a very strong influence in this country. Is there a strong funk scene like that in South Africa too, I presume, that just maybe isn't as influential in the United States yet? And if so, how do we hear it?
Yeah, well, man, I think there was like a band called the Big Dudes that played with Brenda Fassie And there was a lot of funk movements, but I think, over the years, jazz has kind of like taken center stage in South Africa. Yeah, yeah, it's like everything has a sense of jazziness in it, So, unlike in Nigeria where Afrobeat is really dominant, it became like Fela Kuti movement. But you can see how Fela Kuti was writing letters to Masegela and back, You can tell those kind of connections in the music. But I think South Africa leans heavily into what I try to now differentiate between jazz and the jazziness. Because I think the jazziness is older than jazz. And this is another relationship that we're still trying to figure a language for. Because when we talk about jazz, we talk about like we think of it as something that happened over the Atlantic. But when we talk about the jazziness, it's earlier, improvisation, syncopation, all of these things were already there.
So when you say jazziness, you mean like techniques, not just phrases?
Well, when I say the jazziness, I mean the vocabulary of the things that would count as jazz much later, that were already there in Africa before the Atlantic.
The fundamental elements.
Yeah. So it helps us to really locate the music as well, to not see it as something that only comes to us, but something that comes from us. You see, because it gets polluted, of course, in the definitions when like other features start to invade, as it always happens. When the definitions, it's interesting for me how we have Western classical music and Indian classical music, and then a collapse into this abstract idea of world music for African music. They say it's world music. And again, like how the system would always take from Africa. Everything else is classical, but African music is world music. What is this abstract globality about African things? And we struggle to say, this is from Africa. We collapse it into an abstract universal. And it's the same thing with the idea of a university and thinking about where it's situated. It's not in Africa. That's why we're struggling. The curriculum is not in Africa. That's why people are questioning the decolonial moment was really about how do we create a pluriversality where all of these things start to appear in curriculum and the geopoliticalness becomes the point of departure. So there are those blurred areas when we talk about jazz as well that, of course, it must be shifted elsewhere.
Great questions. Gosh, we could do a whole nother hour on that, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Nduduzo. This is a very special year for us that you're joining us. It's our 25th anniversary year, so we're so thankful that you're able to come through during this particular time. For those who are in our audience, we've got a couple of signature events coming up this year that I want to let you know about. In the Yard Film and Music event is happening at the end of August. That's when we celebrate Charlie Parker, and we'll also acknowledge some other great luminaries from Kansas City. This is our 25th anniversary, as I mentioned, so we will have an exhibition that will start in September and run through April, so look out for that as well. Also, as Nduduzo mentioned, he's in the Blue Room tonight at 8:30 and 10 o'clock, so please come back and join us for that. In the band is Logan Richardson, Francisco Mela, and Lonnie Plaxico. So we expect a full room tonight. This is such a talented group. And these free programs are made possible by our donors and our members like you to support the museum through contributions and purchasing memberships. Please visit us online at theamericanjazzmuseum.org to purchase a membership today, or visit our swing shop online or in person. We've got really wonderful exclusive merchandise for you to look at, and your support really matters to us. So again, we want to sustain programs like this Big Break and many of the others that we offer our community throughout the year. So please continue to support us and think about getting a membership as well. Thank you so much. Let's put our hands together one more time for Nduduzo Makhathini.
Siyabonga.
And enjoy your day and evening. Thank you so much for joining us.